Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for NSF Agora Conversations. I'm Eugene Finkel, an associate professor of international affairs at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. SNF Agora is a relatively new institute at Johns Hopkins that examines challenges to democracy and identifies actionable solutions. They created this weekly series to offer social scientific, evidence-based approach to exploring difficult political and policy issues that are arising right now around the pandemic. Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and NSF Agora have joined together to create today's webcast about national security and the coronavirus pandemic. Joining me today are Eduardo Moncada, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University, Sarah Parkinson, the Aronson Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and Mira Rapp-Hooper, Schwartzman Senior Fellow for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and Senior Fellow at the China Center at Yale Law School. She just published a book called Shields of the Republic, The Triumph and Peril of America's Alliances, published with Harvard University Press. So thank you all for being here. Today, the four of us will spend about 30 minutes discussing how COVID-19 has been reshuffling alliances, shifting power dynamics, and changing how government, security institutions, and violent actors interact with citizens. With our panelist expertise, we will be focusing especially on the internal and international dynamics in the US, Latin America, and Asia. Then we will open it up for your questions. Anytime throughout this conversation, you can submit your questions through the dialog box, which is right next to the video, or just below it, depending on your device. Now, let's start. So, we often hear military metaphors and terms used to describe the COVID-19 pandemic. Battle, war, campaign. President Trump called himself a wartime president during the pandemic. But what exactly is the role of security institutions or actors, organizations with guns, militaries, police, security services, armed groups, or even drug cartels? What do they do during this crisis? How do they respond to it? So let's do it in this order. Mira, why don't you go first?
Sure, great. I'll say first, thanks so much for having me here. This is a terrific group, and I'm excited for this conversation and to meet these wonderful new colleagues. I'll really take this question in the context of US-China relations, the sort of key geopolitical dynamic we've been seeing at this moment, with both great powers taking a really unusual role on the global stage. Of course, for years now, political scientists and policymakers have pointed to this as the most consequential bilateral relationship for the 21st century, but it appears to be in free fall in this moment. And I would say that the wartime analogy is particularly inapt when it comes to the United States and the role that it's been playing on the global stage. First, when we think of a wartime analogy, this is really meant to rally the domestic populace in a way that the United States experienced during the world wars, for example. But US behavior has departed radically from those critical junctures in this current emergency. First, unlike the global conflagrations of the past, the United States has been completely felled at home with one of the worst COVID responses globally, no matter how you measure this. And this, of course, is far below where we would have expected to see the United States perform. By any reasonable global health metric, the United States was the best prepared for a pandemic before the one that landed on our shores. So this is really, in many ways, a governance failure that we're experiencing in the United States. Second, and unlike past crises, the United States is not playing its traditional global leadership role, attempting to rally countries to a shared response. The world, of course, shares an interest in containing and eventually eliminating this virus because none of us are safe as long as it is somewhere, as well as an interest in the global economic recovery. But the United States has been all too apt to try to deadlock major decision bodies like the G7 and the UN Security Council, and of course, has pulled out of the World Health Organization. So if this is a war, the United States looks like it's in retreat. But the picture looks different if we ask the same question about China. Likely because of the power vacuum left by Washington, China has been conducting an incredibly assertive foreign policy around the globe. This began with its so-called mask diplomacy after it got its own virus outbreak under control, has evolved into a form of diplomacy around the world where China's diplomats have been inclined to criticize democracies for their response to COVID, touting the value and the accomplishments of their own system. But China has also put pressure on territorial conflicts throughout Asia, including Taiwan in the South China Sea, having now just had a border clash with India that caused a massive loss of life or significant loss of life on both sides, and ostensibly is also responsible for a cyber attack on Australia. So China seems to be willing to court escalation on all fronts, taking a lot more risk than we normally expect. So the reason we really shouldn't look at this as a geopolitical war between the United States and China is that despite their very different responses internationally, right now, neither one of these major powers is winning. And instead, they're both contributing to global disorder.
Thank you. Sarah?
Well, thank you for having me as well. This is a super exciting conversation to be a part of. And actually where I'd like to start is picking up on two of the themes that Mira brought up here, which are what are people's expectations of what organizations, specifically military organizations, are capable of doing here, and what are their actual capabilities, right? And one of the interesting things in the region that I study is that a lot of people might expect to have, for non-state actors to have very low capabilities versus state militaries, which might have very high capacities. And we've actually seen some sort of troubling of that particular division. One of the main things that military actors have done, and we see it in the United States and in Russia, doing things like setting up field hospitals, right? This is what the US National Guard does. In a place like Jordan, the Jordanian military was responsible for enforcing curfews and lockdowns. But you also see non-state actors such as the Lebanese organization Hezbollah deploying more than 24,000 medical workers and making ambulances available and sort of fielding public health volunteer teams. So this is actually a really fascinating display of what some of the capabilities of non-state actors might be. Another thing that we're seeing is that, and that's sort of where you see a non-state actor in the case of Hezbollah working in tandem with a state response, which was centered on the Lebanese Ministry of Health. There are also organizations, often militias, and I think Eduardo will talk more about how this is played out in Latin and South America, where organizations are providing their own services sort of on the side and not in tandem with the street, but in a way that might actually benefit public health or in a way that might just be for show, we're out here, we're doing something. One of the examples of this is groups that have been really intent on spraying down streets with disinfectant. And this is a really public act, but it sort of doesn't get to the core of how COVID operates, right? This is to show people that a group is doing something as opposed to really getting into the nitty-gritty of treatment, for example, or enforcing quarantine. We've seen groups like the Lebanese Forces, which is a Lebanese political party, taking people's temperatures in cars. I think one of the other things we need to be thinking about, and we see this with reporting on various what might broadly be called mafia organizations in Italy, is that you see organizations getting into the loan game, given that you have so many small businesses that are struggling. So you see an opening for activities that we might call illicit or criminal. One of the other things that I would expect to happen here is that given ongoing shortages of things like medical supplies, we could see a growth in black and gray markets. But the final thing I think is really important to mention is that in the greater context of a global pandemic, we've also seen the governments and particularly military actors take this as an opportunity to repress both populations and sort of specific groups of people like journalists who have been a thorn in their side, right? So in both Iraq and Lebanon, there have been massive crackdowns on protests and huge violations of human rights in some cases. We've seen discussions about the sort of conditions in Egyptian prisons, for example. So it's important to remember that COVID is not just a policy opportunity for military organizations to act qua COVID, but also in terms of larger goals for a military or non-state military organization in terms of targeting journalists, targeting human rights advocates, and increasing surveillance.
Thank you. Eduardo, what do you have to say about that?
Well, thanks so much for the chance to talk to you guys, Sarah and Mira and Eugene, and everybody out there. I'm going to pick up a little bit on what Sarah was just talking about, because there's some interesting parallels here, even though we're studying very different parts of the world here, right? So on the one hand, in Latin America, where I do most of my work, I think we need to think about sort of the opportunities and the constraints that the pandemic is posing for two actors. On the one hand, police and militaries are playing a central role in enforcing public health policy, right? So for example, in Ecuador, where the port city of Guayaquil is sort of an epicenter of the virus in the region, the national government placed the armed forces in charge of enforcing the quarantine and coordinating the transport of personal protective equipment and other basic goods into the area. In El Salvador, police and military run checkpoints between the country's municipalities to limit civilian movement as part of a very stringent quarantine. And you find similar sort of enhanced roles for everyday policing and militarization of public health across the region. And so this discourse of a war or a battle against COVID-19, I think, has some really real implications in the Latin American scenario. Economic and political crises in Latin America have often served as an opportunity for state security forces to gain more political power, right? Often through undemocratic means like coups or alliances with particular segments of society that jockey for power. And so the crisis has enabled these state security institutions and structures, on the one hand, to show their relevance and their capacity to deliver when other civilian state institutions have not. And second, to become tools for political competition, right? And this is particularly worrisome as elections at various levels of government in the region have been postponed across the region due to COVID. So already a bedrock of sort of democratic rule is in limbo. And now you add politicians using the military and the police to bolster their support, and even bringing the military into their political fights with other branches of government. This becomes really worrisome, right? So for the military and those actors who see the military as a way to obtain power, I think the pandemic has become a political opportunity. And this is worrisome, echoing some of what Sarah said, because militarization of policing and the use of the military in partisan politics generates a host of negative outcomes: human rights abuses, the erosion of the legitimacy of civilian institutions and democratic norms. Second, and quickly, armed criminal organizations are also being impacted by the crisis, right? It presents opportunities and constraints for many different types of criminal organizations that operate in Latin America. So take the example of gangs. In some parts of the region, like El Salvador, gangs in some localities are actually enforcing quarantines in the neighborhoods that they control, right? Drug trafficking organizations in parts of Mexico have been giving out basic goods like food to populations who, because of the crisis, are unable to work and feed themselves. This isn't about criminal actors becoming benevolent rulers, right? Criminal actors are instead acting strategically to advance their interests, namely territorial control to facilitate their illicit activities, from extortion to drug trafficking. So here, criminal groups are filling the gaps left by absent or weak states whose capacities are under stress given the current crisis. And so criminal groups are enforcing order where the state cannot or will not, and satisfying basic needs where the state fails to do so. And that can bolster criminal groups' grasp on territory as populations become more willing to keep silent in the face of their illicit activities.
Thank you. So several of you mentioned or talked about capacity of different organizations. Now, when we look at civilian institutions, so civilian government and militaries, militias, armed groups, which set of those institutions you think was better prepared to deal with the pandemic, the civilians or the people with the guns and the tanks? So whoever wants to go first can take it. Just jump in.
I could just jump in on one point there. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about, drawing the distinction between civilian or state and non-state, right? And it gets kind of blurry, especially in the realm that I research, which is just crime and violence in the region, where there's a lot of overlap between political and criminal actors. So you think about, for example, drug trafficking organizations. You think, well, maybe the pandemic is sort of a boon for them in terms of their ability to operate in contexts where the state is already taxed, doesn't have capacity, et cetera. But the state, these criminal organizations are also highly dependent on state and state activities to be able to carry out their activities, like the transport of drugs. So for example, drug trafficking organizations in Mexico were not prepared for a slowdown in global trade as part of the response to COVID. And being able to not get their precursor chemicals to produce things like methamphetamines in Mexico, and not being able to get those methamphetamines across the border into the United States, the major consumer of drugs in the world, those sort of show the weaknesses in part of those groups because of their reliance on state and state institutions and activities.
Thank you. Sarah, Mira?
So the precursors to methamphetamine is actually an interesting lead into something that I think it's worth mentioning because it's what people generally consider when they're talking about military responses to things like pandemic, which is that military organizations are known for being really good at logistics, right? They're really good at global supply chains. They're really good at logistics. So in that sense, they have a particular advantage over a lot of civilian institutions because they know how to just move stuff, right? And if we're talking about, dry goods that people need to live, right? The Jordanian military was delivering bread to people. But we're also talking about organizations that are very often quite secretive, which can be a huge impediment to sort of dealing with an outbreak, especially within the context of armed forces. And I'm actually going to return to that in a second. The second thing I would say, and this is something for people who even see this happening in their own communities, is that many non-state armed actors, and this might be groups that we refer to as gangs or mafias or militias or militant groups, are extraordinarily sensitive to threats to their constituencies. They're often going to have any group might have a different relationship than the group next to it. One militia might actually be deeply embedded in a community, and one might be extraordinarily extractive and abusive. But one of the things to think about here is that in states that have deeply marginalized populations where states are not responsive to their needs, one of these groups might actually be much better suited to respond to a crisis that deeply affects them and renders them even more vulnerable, right? When we're talking about needs that the state has not been able to fulfill, in many cases, these are the kinds of groups who are in there, who have lists of residents, who actually know what people's medical conditions are if they've been providing healthcare for, in some cases, decades. And that's an important thing to consider as we think about a holistic pandemic response, is that in some cases, when you have people who don't trust a state, they might actually trust the non-state actor down the road. The only other thing that I would sort of note here is that there have been outbreaks in various state militaries, and the way that states have dealt with them is a really interesting measure, not just of sort of democracy and autocracy and these sorts of things, but also of preparedness. So one of the things that you also see among military organizations, and I think this also breaches the state non-state division that I've sort of been playing with here, is that military organizations are figuring out what they actually would do in a context of war, going back to the initial question, right? So the Russian military has been using COVID to sort of test some of its response teams to nuclear, biological, and chemical response teams, right? So just sending them off on disinfection deployments. And so this is, given the setting, even though it is not a war, and I fully believe that that's a distinction that needs to be made, it does give military organizations a chance to sort of test out capabilities in a way where civilian institutions might be more being put to the test.
Thank you. So Mira, yep.
Fascinating set of comments by Eduardo and Sarah. I just want to make one general point that I think they're actually both implying that I just want to sort of raise to the surface. And that is the fact that sort of in the early weeks of the pandemic, there was a lot of debate about what regime type would lend itself better to a COVID response. That is, in particular, would authoritarian governments have a natural advantage over democracies because of their ability to impose top-down, hierarchical, very stringent containment measures when it came to the virus. And I think that's something that's a little more interesting than that, frankly, that we've seen over the course of the last few months, is that the response and its efficacy tends not to break out neatly by regime type. That is to say that authoritarian countries do better and democracies necessarily do worse, but rather that regardless of the regime type or within regime type, the capacity of the state and relative levels of trust in government makes a huge difference in the ability of the state to respond. So if you look at democracies, we've sort of seen them sort into two classes. One class is a set of democracies where the response has been excellent. And those tend to be countries that have relatively technocratic leaders, that have high levels of trust in government, that had very sort of cleanly prepared disaster preparedness, and a lot of willingness amongst the population to go along with it. So in Europe, I'm thinking of Germany. In Asia, I'm thinking of South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. But you have a whole other set of democracies, and those tend to be the ones that are governed by populist leaders that took a fairly know-nothing approach to the virus in its early weeks, that were loath to impose virus containment and control measures, and as a result have been at the world's highest levels of cases. I'm thinking there, of course, of the United States, but also of India and of Brazil. And similarly, there's some variation amongst authoritarian states. That is, some authoritarians have used this, as Sarah and Eduardo have been saying, as an opportunity for a power grab to consolidate their own control. Some have used their authoritarian tools and tactics to more effectively contain the virus than others. So I think this is a very interesting moment for the study of regime type and the fact that there are these capacity issues that are absolutely front and center to the management of the virus that can't be cleanly explained by regime alone.
Thank you. Now,
quickly
go ahead, Eduardo. Yeah,
because I thought Mira's points was excellent, and I agree completely. And I think what's interesting as well is that you could take those same points about the lack of neatness and falling on one end of the regime type versus the other, and the response and the correlation with the response, and look inside countries as well, right? So look inside the United States, and we think about sort of the liberal South, right, which many Americans talk about in terms of liberal practices, and we've seen, unfortunately, in terms of sort of voting practices in plain view over the last few weeks. Compare the responses there with the responses in the Northeast, right, where New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut have essentially decided to quarantine themselves from the rest of the country, and are somehow declaring that they won't allow people to come in without quarantining from those high incidence states. So you see some really interesting sort of subnational variation as well, right, in terms of sort of levels of democracy within countries, responses by those subnational units as well. So I'll just throw that in there.
A great point.
Yeah, thanks, Eduardo. It actually gets us to my next question. Now, the pandemic is changing how security institutions, alliances, societies operate and interact with each other. So my question for you is, how is the pandemic actually changing those military alliances or security arrangements or security or armed institutions more generally? How they change them internally, and also how the pandemic changes how they interact with each other, governments, civilians. So Eduardo, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think, interestingly, I think the crisis is generating an opportunity for both sort of state security institutions and criminal groups to make themselves more relevant to civilians, and by extension to politicians and states, right? So the increasingly sort of visible role for state security institutions, military and police, brings them back into the center of political debates about democracy and governance in Latin America. So throughout the late 20th century, there were already sort of worrisome trends where civilians were increasingly approving of the armed forces more so than other institutions critical for democracy, like political parties and legislative bodies. So what will be, I think, critical to look for moving forward is whether and how the armed forces and police bodies in Latin America, at least, leverage this political opportunity to obtain more power, that power grab that Mira was talking about. And power means everything from elected office, right, to informal influencing of policymaking, to obtaining and keeping economic resources, right? So will we see more police and military personnel, both active and retired, running for public office? Will the armed forces and police lobby to make permanent the resources and the formal and informal authorities that they've been given during this emergency? So I think these are just some of the ways that we need to assess how security institutions may change in response to the pandemic. And with regards to criminal organizations, I think here it's worth considering how the crisis is impacting relations with civilians, particularly their victims, right? So 2 points worth highlighting here. On the one hand, in some ways, the pandemic is making it easier for criminal groups to engage in particular forms of violence as quarantine measures restrict the mobility of populations. So for example, in Colombia, where I've done some work, armed groups have leveraged the quarantine to more easily locate and assassinate social and political activists that have spoken out against the armed groups and or against their interests in legal economies like land markets and markets for natural resources. So on the one hand, the state policy facilitates violence by these armed actors. On the other hand, even though much of our research on criminal organizations in Latin America focuses on the drug trade, It's important to remember that these groups also engage in a wide variety of types of crime, things like extortion. So in places like El Salvador, Colombia, Brazil, the majority of the populations in particular neighborhoods and even cities pay regular formal, informal taxes to groups that control territory, right? So what's happened during the pandemic when businesses can't open, people can't generate money and work, we see tremendous variation across the region. This goes back to Sarah's point about how you can see variation even from one group next to another group in places, right? Where some criminal actors are continuing to charge the extortion fees, even if their victims can't pay. Others have postponed and forgiven them and saying they'll return back to collecting taxes when things come back to normal. And still in other places, victims are simply saving the money because they know that the criminal gangs are going to ask for that money once things go back to normal, right? So I think this raises important questions we need to consider in our research about how some of these pre-existing conditions may influence the behaviors and change some of the behaviors of these criminal groups during the crisis. And it highlights the need for a lot more research in that area.
Thank you. Sarah?
Right, so this is an excellent jumping off point. And I think that some of the things that Eduardo has sort of surfaced here give me a good starting point to talk about some of the sort of ideological and symbolic dimensions of what a lot of these groups are up to right now. So if we sort of think about states and security and non-state actors, one of the sort of questions, especially when we get through to what does the response look like, is reputation, right? And a lot of these actors are extraordinarily reputationally conscious. And what COVID has done is sort of shaken up the field enough for people to start trying out opportunities. One of the really interesting places where we've seen this is, groups that many Americans might not be sympathetic with, Islamic State, for example, or again, Lebanese Hezbollah, have been taking sort of COVID as an opportunity to talk a lot about inequalities in the United States, right? And this is a fascinating thing because these groups, again, obviously people aren't deeply sympathetic to them in the United States for a number of reasons, or not broad swaths of the population. But something that, Hassan Nasrallah, who is the Secretary General of Hezbollah, brought up is President Trump's repeated naming of COVID-19 as the Chinese virus, right? And this is sort of this opportunity for someone who is the head of a group, again, that doesn't garner a lot of sympathy in, the American polity to say something that sounds a little bit like a lot of what we're saying about racism in the United States right now. So this sort of muddying, and this is an extraordinarily strategic speaker who is doing this for a reason and doing this to get the headline of calling President Trump, the quote was, an honorless, racist, non-human, right? We also see a bunch of organizations that are sort of using the idea of rumors to try to get ahead of each other. So rival Kurdish parties have been accusing each other of smuggling people with COVID into the area in an attempt to sort of overthrow the government. It doesn't actually matter if this is true or not. What this is a statement about capability and capacity, right? So again, it's not necessarily about sympathy. It is about making this rhetorical claim on an enemy, right? And that's an extremely clever military tactic. But then you also see, and this is another example from Kurdistan or from Iraqi Kurdistan, is that you have regions, again, that are treated unequally. So Kurdish healthcare providers haven't been paid for 50 days at this point. And that's because of a particular arrangement between the Iraqi central government that is located in Baghdad and the more autonomous Kurdish government that governs the three provinces of Iraqi Kurdistan. And because of how revenues are shared in a global oil crisis, you actually see one entire region that is governed by two parties that also field Peshmerga, who were, central to the battle against ISIS, suffering quite deeply because of this financial arrangement. So the way in which different organizations are thinking through what does it mean to have health security? What does it mean to pay salaries in a region that has had referenda on autonomy? These sorts of things. It's a couple of really disparate examples, but all of this sort of gets back to that this isn't just about the materiality of COVID, it's also about how different actors are jockeying for position in a more symbolic space.
Thank you. Mira?
Great. Yeah, I'll take this question again from the international security and sort of geopolitical perspective, because I think one of the things that the pandemic has done is to really lay bare the ill preparedness of the United States and its allies for a problem like this one. The United States has a sort of sprawling network of defensive alliances, primarily with its NATO allies in Europe and allies in Asia. And the system has actually been remarkably successful at deterring and defending against conventional and nuclear conflict. That's what it was designed to do in the early days of the Cold War. But part of what this unbelievable global tragedy has done is to show that an architecture like this one really is not prepared to deal with all manner of non-military threats in the 21st century. Now, this was actually a set of forces, a set of trends that was already underway well before COVID broke out. Russia and China had already devised strategies well before this pandemic that sought to weaken the American alliance system without ever using force. So I'm thinking here of Russia's strategies for disinformation and election interference, which aimed to rend NATO and European Union unity without ever firing a shot, or China's use of island building and militarization in the South China Sea, all sort of subconventional activities that nonetheless weaken the American alliance system. So there was already a need for the United States and its closest allies to be thinking about how to renovate this system to cope with the non-military challenges, which so clearly were becoming more salient in the 21st century. But what the pandemic has really laid bare is the fact that these security institutions are not at all prepared for a borderless, faceless, stateless type of threat that can nonetheless jeopardize the lives and well-being of all of the allies in the network, as well as the rest of the world. So what I think that this pandemic is going to do, I hope it's going to do, frankly, is accelerate a process by which the United States and its allies think about renovating this system for the 21st century, to apply certainly to things like cyber attacks and election interference, but also to try to figure out how to use this alliance network to not only mitigate the effects of this pandemic, but prepare for the next one. Think about how to use formal alliances for things like supply chain security to ensure that allies are more resilient in the face of another global crisis. So as I see it, these trends towards non-military threats and needing to think about how to combat them were already well underway, but the pandemic has reminded us that the type of defense and deterrence we thought about on an interstate level were really designed for the Cold War, and we are decades past a need to renovate them.
You know, if I can jump in on this point, something that Mira just said made me think about this intersection of election security and social media and how we have all of these narratives and rumors that sort of COVID has unleashed, not just on the US electorate, but globally. And the way in which just injecting certain types of narratives into social media at this point, which we know has been done both by parties in our own electorate, but also by external parties, can have incredible power to shape elections. So if we're thinking about low-cost ways for groups to basically capitalize on a moment that I think many of us agree is a moment of American weakness, it's actually incredibly scary to think about that. And to combine that with, you know, a less than desirable or a weak COVID response with a complete misunderstanding of how to actually combat the type of disinformation, but also this sort of, think of it as if you were like using a crowbar to get out a tree stump or something. If the tree stump is loose already and you're gonna like pry it out with the crowbar, a lot of groups see sort of the language around COVID and inequality, and particularly racial inequality, in a government that doesn't seem to understand how to manage it as a real moment for them to move into the fray in a way that they haven't before, because they see the possibility for resonance that hasn't existed on sort of this broad of a scale, I think.
Thank you. Now, let's take a few questions from the audience. And again, if you have a question for our panel, you can ask it through the dialog box on the screen to the right or below the video. We have several very interesting questions. So let's take this one. Given Mira's points about the changing nature of this pandemic threat and such future crisis, is the nation state the right unit of security to be thinking about? So who wants to go first? I guess, Mira, it was in response to your point, so why don't you try to deal with that?
Well, it's a great question. I would say that the nation state is the primary unit we're likely to be left with, but there's a lot of reason to believe that the nation state alone is not enough. So we could think about Eduardo's excellent point about the huge degree of variation within a federal system like the United States about responses, right? One of the lessons learned should clearly be that we were underinvested, not just on the national level, but on the state and local level within the United States to prepare for a disaster like this. So I do think going forward, we will see a doubling down on state and local level preparedness and thinking about these units as the frontline units of response. And then there's clearly a second area in which responses have broken down, and that's at the international level and when it comes to international cooperation. Whether we're pointing to the fact that China may have undue influence in the World Health Organization, the fact that the United States has just pulled out of it, or that the WHO doesn't have nearly the teeth we might like an international organization to have to really compel any form of international policy at a crisis like this one, I think it's been laid pretty bare that the world desperately needs more by way of international global health regimes than it currently has. So while I still think that the nation state is very likely to be the primary actor, both as we continue to navigate this crisis and any future ones that we might meet, it's also very clear that without improved international regimes and also increased focus on these state and local level responses, our fate the next time around may not look a whole lot better.
Thank you. Eduardo, Sarah, any of you want to take this question?
It just occurred to me that this is a scary thought, but none of us have brought up this issue. And to be clear, I'm not a political economist, but one of my immediate reactions to this question was, well, we haven't talked about markets. And if we're thinking about responses and nation state responses, we need to think about how all of them are sort of tied into global economies and global supply chains and what massive global inequality will do in terms of healthcare access or access to a vaccine or even testing for a vaccine, and the way in which the potential for a very small number of corporations to have extraordinary influence on millions of or billions of people's lives with actually very little intervention from any of the actors that we've talked about is something that I don't know that we've fully grappled with. As someone who works predominantly on military organizations, I'm sort of used to thinking about what their usual supply chains are, right? Some of the work I've done is on weapons smuggling, but this is just so very different. And the way in which you can think about governments and especially these more marginalized populations winding up being beholden to a very small, very powerful group of actors, I think has massive implications for how they'll be able to wield power in sort of the coming years.
Thank you. Okay. Now, let's take another question. So do the symbolic dimensions of what we are seeing imply a broken link between popular politics and institutional politics around the world? And if yes, how do we move forward from that? So is the chain broken? What do you think?
Could you actually repeat that one, please?
Yeah, so do the symbolic dimensions of what we are seeing imply a broken link between popular politics and institutional politics? And if yes, how do we fix that?
It's a really good question.
Yeah, it is. So, yeah, if you think about broken trust and non-state actors stepping in, then what does it say about how people behave and view the government and politics and the actual formal institutions of politics?
I would just throw in quickly that it doesn't. I think it's a great question, and I think one of the dangers that it implies is that the relationship between state and societies is sort of zero sum, right? That societies either believe their government is legitimate or not legitimate, and turn to their government or don't turn to the government for goods and services. But I think at least in the Latin American scenario, what you find is much more diversity in terms of alliances between state and society, and the linkages sort of span a variety of different institutions, different political actors and political parties, as well as an array of non-state actors as well, right? So in marginalized communities in parts of Latin America, you'll find that communities rely equally on criminal actors as well as state actors, right, to satisfy goods and services, just for different ones at different points in time. And so I think what the question, at least the way I would think about the question, is that it's not necessarily sort of that linkage isn't necessarily broken. It's become a bit thinner in some places as communities sort of diversify, who they turn to for information, for resources, for security, for order.
Yeah, the example that sort of comes to mind for me is that every year Iran has a day that sort of celebrates the Iranian military, right? And it's usually a big display of military weaponry and tanks and soldiers marching and all this sort of thing. And this year it was a medical demonstration. It was people on 4x4s that had like stretchers on the back of them to carry patients. It was people who were in biohazard suits. So it was, entirely geared around sort of health as security. But given the caseload in Iran, which really was where the pandemic began in the Middle East, I think that for many Iranians, this was this massive symbolic display that rang really hollow. And that's not to say that a bunch of people really believed the message of previous parades to this extent that sent the missiles down a main boulevard or something. But what it does is sort of shows that it's not just about oh yeah, they're throwing a military parade, ignore it. It's no, they were really supposed to be able to help us medically and couldn't. And that's because of a number of dynamics, including that the regime saw, external recognition of just how bad the pandemic was as a security issue and a regime stability issue, right? But what comes to mind here is that might be something that feels common to Iranians, where you just don't sort of believe the symbolic display, right? And people have written about this in other authoritarian contexts where the display is about occupying space. It's not about belief. But what I sort of think about, and this gets to Eduardo's point, is if many people in what we might refer to as the global north are also starting to think, well, was what my government was doing a display? Right? If there are between 120 and 130,000 Americans dead right now, was all of this sort of greatest nation, this, that, the other thing, just a display? And what does that mean for how I engage with my government now? What does this mean for Italians who suffered enormously at the beginning of this pandemic? What does it mean for people who sort of thought they had a government to go to, not those who weren't really under that sort of assumption in the first place? One of the states, and admittedly, one of the government responses that has been complimented is Lebanon's. And part of that is, I think, because no one really expected the state to do anything. And, Rafik Hariri Hospital has actually done an enormous job in preparedness in a very low capacity state. I think where you have this division between people assume there's capacity and there really isn't, is where you're going to see going forward this real dip in trust for the government.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we have only 1 minute left and we can't take all the questions, but there is one question that I would want you to answer in 20 seconds. If you could wave a magic wand, what would be the kind of institutions you would create to make us safer, and more prepared in the future, both domestically and internationally? Again, 20 seconds each. Any takers?
Are we working with the assumptions of where we are now? I wave the magic wand now with the situation we're in now?
Yes. I'm assuming that, yes. It's a question from the audience.
From what I gauge from my colleagues at Johns Hopkins Public Health, what you want is really widespread contact tracing that still respects people's civil liberties and human rights. One of the big questions moving forward is whether all of these apps can adequately protect people's privacy, whether there are lockdowns on where the data is stored, whether it's central or whether it's not, whether there's voluntary reporting. So what it sounds like is we need an immense contact tracing effort that cannot or is insulated from abuse by governments, right? Because people want this kind of surveillance now, but the way that that kind of thing can be weaponized in the future is extraordinarily dangerous, and it's hard to go back once all of that data is out there.
Thank you. Eduardo, Mira, anyone before we close?
I'd like to see, certainly in the United States, massive reinvestment in our domestic preparedness capabilities on the state, local, and national level. But I would also, and I think we can do this without, let's say, decoupling from all of our international supply chains. That is, we don't need to move towards autarky to make sure that our strategic stockpiles of health equipment are sound. But I'd also like to see an international institution like the WTO have an international database for public health equipment and supplies, such that if another pandemic breaks out somewhere in the world, it's much easier for states to coordinate on where there are excess supplies that are available for countries in need, and for those shipments to proceed quickly and in an efficient manner that helps the worst off.
Thank you. So Eduardo, Sarah, and Mira, thank you for being here today. It was a fascinating conversation. And thanks to our audience for watching and for sending in your great questions. A recording of today's webcast will be available online at nsfagora.jhu.edu. Thanks again for joining us today, and please make sure to join the next installment of NSF Agora Institute webcasts on July 10th. The topic of our next conversation will be protest, activism, and organizing. The panelists will include Kanisha Bond, an assistant professor of political science at SUNY Binghamton, Felipe Campante, vice dean for education and academic affairs at SAIS, and Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of International Economics at Johns Hopkins, and Erica Chenoweth, Bertolt Bates Professor in Human Rights and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School. The panel will be moderated by NSF Agora Institute Director Harry Han. Thank you.
Thank you.